I just saw in the chat there, it looks like there are some folks from out of Vermont in the webinar. And I think there was, I think just level setting that this is intended for Vermont audiences. We're happy to have you here, but we will be discussing Vermont legislation and state statutes. So there might be some parts that do not feel applicable to everyone in the room.
Thanks. So tree ordinance basics for Vermont communities. Again, we will be covering something specific to Vermont, and we are recording the webinar. So if you're not comfortable having your camera turned on during that, I do understand, but certainly it's nice for me to be able to see you on the other end. So the agenda, realizing you're not seeing my screen. There, do folks see the agenda popping up on your screen? Great. I'm going to spend a little bit of time reviewing the state statutes that pertain to municipal trees. There's a wealth of information about all these state statutes available on our website, and we have kind of a crib sheet for you to look through that. But I did want to touch on some of the high-level basics just to make sure we're level set today. We'll talk briefly about, Robert mentioned shade tree preservation plans. We're talking about tree ordinances, tree policies. What's the difference? Why would you want one over another? What happens if you have none of those? We'll kind of touch on all of those points. A list of resources, and also really link you most prominently to our freshly updated tree ordinance guide for municipalities that we finished just a couple weeks ago. As much as we have time, we'll look at an outline of a tree ordinance, the sections that we recommend that could be in there. That may be the part that we truncate a bit just to allow for more discussion, because it is all outlined in detail in our tree ordinance guide. Hear from Brattleboro and keep the discussion going. So there are pictures in this presentation. They have nothing to do with the text apart from their generally have to do with urban forestry and trees. I just wanted you to have something to look at while we ran through some of our state statutes summaries. So there's a lot of high level points that we can pull out of easily over a dozen, probably over 24 different sections in state statute that pertain in one way or another to municipal trees. And if you're considering writing a tree ordinance or updating a tree ordinance, or even figuring out if your community needs a tree ordinance, you have to spend the time on these state statutes and understand kind of what is now currently the level set as of 2020 updated in state statute. And so one of those, which is not new at all, is that every municipality must appoint a tree warden. Sometimes we have select board members acting as tree wardens briefly while there's a vacancy, but ultimately there needs to be someone who is a tree warden. It can be a road commissioner, it can be a select board member, it can be actually now someone from out of your town, but it is a required position within a municipality. The tree warden, long story short, is in control of shade trees in the municipality. And if you're a tree warden, you probably knew this already, but the definition of shade trees is now set as shade trees specifically are trees planted by the municipality on municipally owned land or in municipal rights of way. So even if you would like shade trees to mean something different, this is actually what it means in state law. And so that is kind of one of our overarching recommendations, is to be using these terms correctly as they are defined in state law. You may have lots of other terms in there that your community can define, but these are specific terms when referring to state statute. So that means that roadside trees, park trees, and other trees growing on municipal land that were not planted by the municipality are not shade trees. They still may be municipally managed trees, but they are not under the jurisdiction of the tree warden. Some of you have had really good questions about, well, what if we just don't know who planted it? It's a 250-year-old tree. We're not really sure. You know, there will be some level of a straight face test to imagine whether or not a tree planted, you know, in the center of the town green was likely planted by the municipality or under its auspices versus a forest edge tree at the edge of a right of way. But as per state law stands, those trees that were not planted by the municipality, while they may be managed by the town or city, they are not actually shade trees. But it goes on. You may like to have more shade trees than those just planted by the municipality. And so there's now a mechanism to do that, a shade tree preservation plan that outlines several required tree management duties and may designate more trees as shade trees than just those as were defined. And this is the primary way that the tree warden jurisdiction may be expanded if the municipality wants that. And lastly, before we can pause from the quick review of state statutes, municipalities may adopt a tree ordinance that expands or creates new provisions to meet local tree canopy growth and protection goals. And a tree ordinance can include the required and optional elements of a shade tree preservation plan. And I think Robert and Mary will be able to speak to that, of how they've taken part of state statute and wrapped it into a tree ordinance. And an ordinance codifies how a municipality will plant and maintain trees in municipal rights of way and on municipal property. So this is a really big step to go from baseline state law up to maybe having extra shade trees, all the way up to having a much more proactive approach to how you're going to grow a really healthy canopy. And we've had a lot of discussions recently about really how to make tree ordinances tree positive, not sort of listing a list of problems, but listing a lot of opportunities that come from planting and maintaining trees in your municipal ways and places. So our next section is on the shade tree preservation plan specifically, but I wanted to pause and ask if anyone has a comment or question or thing that's just become brand new to you so far in our quick review of state statutes pertaining to municipal trees. You're welcome to unmute and jump in, or there is a raise hand button, which we will see too. Warren, go ahead.
Question way back at the beginning, where is it required that every municipality in Vermont have a tree warden? And if they choose not to, what's the recourse for that?
So yes, it is required. It's in state statute. And I'll have share a couple of web pages to you where you can actually read the statute that it's required. If they don't have one, what are their recourses? I honestly don't know. I mean, then there could be decisions that have to be made by someone and no one with the authority. There's no one with the authority to make them. So you might get into a legal battle. Do you have have you seen this roll out in some way?
No, but I know that there's communities in Vermont that don't have a tree warden, and it's like no big deal. We don't need one or whatever. They're whatever their excuse is. So it's typically handled by the road superintendent per se in communities like that, which can be an issue as far as if you're looking at preserving trees. So anyway,
Absolutely.
I just wondered if there was any recourse from the state to be a little bit more authoritative on forcing the hand.
I mean, it's a great question, and one that I think is our main outlet right now is education, that you do have to have a tree warden. Here's the statute where it says, here's what the tree warden does. I think your point of people being like, we don't need one, is probably the easiest miscommunication about the information. That being said, most of tree wardens are volunteers. Sometimes it can be hard to find someone. And like you say, it may be passed to the road commissioner, to a select board member, to someone else. And that's okay too. There's sometimes where a paid staff member is maybe a logical person to be a tree warden. It depends a little bit on the conflict of interest, but it is okay to have that be a paid position.
Yeah, I think we're doing pretty good in Vermont as far as I don't know, maybe Elise would know the number of tree wardens in the state that are actually in the position, if you will. But I think we're doing way better than we were.
Yeah, I can look into our reporting database while Joanne's talking, and I'll put it in the chat how many we have reported for 2024.
I've mentioned, I'll go on to the next section, and then I do want to make sure you have several webpage links. I've got them up here as well. So after this little section, I'll scoot over to the internet. But I did want to touch on a shade tree preservation plan, because if you decide as a community that the state laws that we just very quickly reviewed, there's a lot more to them than just 2 slides. If you decide that those laws are sufficient for your trees in your public ways and places, then then you're good. You've got a bunch of state laws that pertain to municipal trees. I'm thinking of one particular example of a town where the tree warden realized that the town actually had no municipally owned land. Even where their town office was leased from the school board. So there's actually no municipal property. There was a lot of municipal right of way, but it was really entirely forested. And this tree warden was like, well, do I have duties? And when it came, they did still have a tree warden. She was doing a lot of optional work, outreach, education, trying to get trees planted on private property or school board property. But when it came down to the actual laws of what was pertaining to her work, they were covered. But if you look at that and you feel like maybe primarily the shade tree definition is not sufficient for your municipality, or your municipality has a lot more details than just municipally planted tree or not, maybe you have different zoning, different, residential parts, rural parts, all kinds of things where you want to address trees differently and would like to expand the role of the tree warden, the shade tree preservation plan is the way to do that. And we've got a whole other webpage on all those elements, and many towns that have done much of this work to independently have a shade tree preservation plan that clarifies 5 required elements, which are very briefly summarized here, summarizing the tree or shrub planting program description for your municipality, which could be very detailed, or it could be the tree board will meet every fall and decide what we're going to plant next spring. It might be like that. There's a lot of options. A maintenance plan for your shade trees. A cost for your tree wardens. Is this a position you're going to be paying for? Or if someone else decides to hire your tree warden, should that someone else be paying your tree warden? Many municipalities end up saying, well, our tree warden is a volunteer, and this is what we expect this position to be paid. Others say it's actually our parks director, and their tree warden duties are volunteer, but they are paid under the auspices of their director position. If there are any shared responsibilities of shade trees, for example, trees that are near municipal cemeteries that may also have a cemetery commission weighing in. We had a really neat case where there was a new municipal skate park in one town, and they realized there was a skate park committee as well, and that both organizations were actually like in charge of trees. So outlining any shared responsibility of shade trees that should be specified and codified, and determining the process for removal of dead, diseased, or dying shade trees or risk trees as any further than is already specified in state statutes. And there's a bunch of processes already in there about notifications and warning and ability to appeal that. Optionally, you can designate additional shade trees by zones, all the trees on this road, all the trees in the right of way there, all the trees in the skate park, whatever it is that you're trying to add, or base them as a tree by tree basis, designate them on a tree by tree basis based on cultural, historic, or aesthetic characteristics. So that may be certain ash trees that you've decided to treat with an insecticide to preserve their longevity. And that tree, although not municipally planted, you don't want to lose that investment. And that tree is designated as the shade tree and has a series of protections awarded to that. Again, a lot more to know about this, but I did want to kind of brush over what is in a shade tree preservation plan, because if you are going from state law up one notch, you'd be at shade tree preservation plan. And we can certainly help write those. We have done that already. And these are plans that ultimately need to be approved by, have at least one public hearing and be approved by the select board and the tree warden. So it's a big process. It's a big outreach and education process in each town, and it looks different for each town. So before we go to tree ordinance goals, any questions on shade tree preservation plans? Or reflections? As far as I know, there's only 3 municipalities who have had their shade tree preservation plans accepted by their select board or legislative body, Brattleboro being one of them. Yes, I don't know your name, but I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm Grow Flatibow
Grow.
from Maine, and I was just confused. You say you designate additional shade trees by zones. Can you tell me what those zones would be?
That is up to the town. Yeah, great question. Nice to meet you, girl. Where are you from in Maine?
Just north of Portland, about 10 miles
Cool. Very
in
cool.
Yarmouth.
Well, in Yarmouth. All right. Towns can approach that in whichever the way they want. It could be designated by an actual zoning term, like rural residential, agricultural, forestry, whatever the zone is. More commonly, I see it by location, like all the trees on the right of way on Brook Road, all the trees 6 inches DBH and greater on these 12 streets. You know, that is something that's a zone that they've defined. I've seen it even attempted a little bit by species, you know, all trees except these species that are along municipal rights of way. I mean, it gets into a lot of the more forested rights of way. And then ones that might be a little ambiguous, like you've got a stone wall at the edge of the right of way, a row of sugar maples on the roadside, but no one's quite sure who planted them because they're really old. And maybe the town then decides to designate all trees, you know, on the roadside of the stone wall as shade trees. So it can get very granular, absolutely. And almost better if it does, because then we're all being specific about which ones are being added. And maybe all the way to saying all trees in municipal rights of way and on municipal property are shade trees, are designated as shade trees. And that you know is often how many municipalities worked prior to these 2020 amendments. The tree warden was involved in decisions regarding all trees and rights of ways and in municipal places. Good question. All right. Bear with me as we dive into this next section. So if you've decided as a community that the state laws are great, but not quite enough, shade tree preservation plan lets you maybe expand the jurisdiction of the tree warden, get a little bit more specific about planting and maintenance, shared responsibility, maybe a more in-depth removal process for what constitutes a risk tree. For example, the term risk is never defined. So maybe you've got into that of exactly what that removal might look like. But if you're still wanting to share more information about specific goals and how you're going to do those, then a tree ordinance may be the thing for you. There is the option of a tree policy, and tree policies are not as enforceable as ordinances. They're easier to have accepted by the legislative body in your municipality, but not as enforceable. So it's not, there probably are, some of you may have experience with a tree policy as opposed to a tree ordinance, but the rest of our presentation will really focus on the ordinance, which is not a small project to write or have accepted. And Mary and Robert can share what that looks like in just a moment. So when it comes to writing a tree ordinance, there are several goals that our program decided are pretty important. And there's not a one size fits all for what this looks like. We certainly, on our website, we have many examples of existing tree ordinances in Vermont, many of which predate these 2020 state statute updates. You can certainly go to other states and see how they're writing theirs, but keep in mind, we're still working with Vermont state law. But some important goals that we think are pretty relevant is that your tree ordinance might establish a tree board or committee, really making those assigning some duties and responsibilities to a new and specified group of people. You may include that shade tree preservation plan, all those elements, and designate any additional shade trees if desired within that. Ads can assure us that tree boards are the best, and perhaps you're already staffing all of those, but many towns don't have them, and that may be a really important first step of a tree ordinance, is establishing who's going to be doing this work. Another goal, to define authority and responsibility over municipal trees, including designated shade trees and any trees in municipal rights of way or places that are not shade trees, getting specific about their care, their planting, their removal. Set some standards for tree planting, maintenance, protection, and removal. Set those standards clearly, reference which sources you're using, and particularly if you have a lot of your tree work done in-house, understanding that everyone's on board with those standards and knows what they are and knows how to access them. You may go to establish planting requirements for development. I mean, it's not only about sort of fixing problems as they happen, it's also looking forward to what you want to see growing in your community. So maybe you have requirements about what's happening in the future when there's development. Create tree protection protocols that involve some kind of design review. It can be one thing for the tree warden to be in charge of certain trees, but if they're not notified that anything is going to happen there, then they may never have a chance to actually weigh in on their care. And I mentioned earlier that defining risk and the methods for assessing it should be a really big part of the work that can go into a tree ordinance. At present, there's a whole set of rules regarding removal of risk trees, and the tree warden, risk shade trees, the tree warden is left to work with that information and decide if a tree is a risk tree, but there's no recipe book for how that works. And so a lot of tree wardens have said, like, well, I feel like I'm trying and I'm using my best information, but I'm not held to many standards. And it'd be great to have some more formal procedures about this that everyone is on board with, so that when someone wants to say this tree is a risk tree, we have an actual way to evaluate that. And there are professional standards too by the International Society of Arboriculture. And lastly, getting into roles and responsibilities, there's a lot of fines. There's a lot of things that can happen to you if you willfully damage or take down a shade tree. But it's a lot of work to enforce these things. And so to think about what this looks like in your municipality, who's going to be taking up the reins on assisting the tree warden, supporting the tree warden when it comes to enforcement, fees, appeals process, or any other kinds of fines. I've got a lot of resources listed, and the reason I put the text heavy thing here is not for you to write them all down, but because you'll receive a PDF copy of this slideshow when we're done, and you're welcome to click on those links. I do want to say that we have just updated, so just to share, our municipal tree ordinance guide. It's 11 or 12 pages of captivating reading, of getting into a lot of the detail about what we're covering today and what each of these things can look like. And we also have several web pages that are dedicated to municipal tree ordinances and policies. These are the links that you'll be sent to, including some sample tree ordinances and policies. And as I scroll down, a whole list of resources from both us and Vermont League of Cities and Towns, some videos that review the state statute updates. It's all here for some learning. If you haven't watched some of this already or read these, it does take quite some time to get familiar with all these pieces. And we also have a page dedicated to tree wardens that links you to all of the statutes that pertain to municipal trees. I warned you there are many, and they're absolutely worth reading. And provides more resources for tree wardens as well. So that's just kind of where I'll send you via these other resource links in the follow-up. So from us, from Vermont League of Cities and Towns, who are actually representing you, the municipality, And out there on the internet, there's a couple of resources we've found that apply to not just Vermont, but other ordinance builders that other tree organizations have been working on. It might be worth checking that out. The last brief section I have before I turn it over to the folks in Brattleboro is just about a quick outline of what may be in your tree ordinance. Before I get to that, it's just 2 slides and then over to Brattleboro. Is there any other comments or discussions right now? Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, it found out maybe 3 weeks ago, we had a situation in Essex Junction, and it goes back to one of the key points in the ordinance about defining a risk, whether it be on municipal property or private property. I mentioned this in one of our webinars last week, because it involves some clarification, because the city of Essex Junction has a policy on how we deal with tree issues, but we do not have an ordinance. So in the last paragraph of the policy, we get into describing the tree warden's role in a risk or hazardous tree that's on private property that could fall or endanger the public right-of-way. And a kind of a process for the tree warden to go through to notify the property owner to get them to abate the issue. Okay, in other words, remove it. So I wrote a letter to the property owner and recommended that it go by certified mail to make sure they received it, identifying the issue, what the tree was, its location, the condition, the issues with the tree, and so on. So before the letter was sent, we sent it to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns for comment. And their response was, it was a great response. And it said, we the municipality have no authority to go onto private property to force the tree to be removed, because it was a policy and not an ordinance. If we had defined it into an ordinance, we would have the teeth to go in and pursue it. So this came about years ago when I worked as the city arborist in Burlington. We had a nuisance ordinance that was broad spectrum, and I was able to use it to go onto private property. Whereas that if you notify the people at first, if knock on the door or send a letter, notify them, let them know about the issue and that they needed to address it, remove it, in this case, a tree. If they didn't, we would have the authority to go onto their property, remove the tree, and then bill them. If they refuse not to pay the bill, we could put a lien on their property. So at the time of sale of the property, they'd have to pay us. When I proposed that to Essex Junction back in 2013, when we did the policy, they didn't want to go there with that last piece. So anyway, if we had put it in a policy, we still wouldn't have had the authority because it wasn't an ordinance. I just wanted to mention that. This just played out in the city of Essex Junction 3 weeks ago.
Thanks
Now,
for that one.
What happened with that tree? 3 days later or so, the tree was removed, or a week later. I went, I was noticing, I went by and the tree was being removed. I'm going, wow. So maybe just the letter worked. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that with everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. It sounds similar to maybe Montpelier's ordinance as well. Yeah, ideally you're not being weighed down in the legality of it, but I should absolutely say, I'm not a lawyer, and it's really important to check all the details on that.
Well, it's important for everyone listening to know that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns is our legal advisor for any of these laws. In this particular case, it was this issue.
And they are going to respond to you as tree warden, tree committee, whatever your role is in your municipality, much more than they will respond to me as a state worker, because they serve you. So it's good to know. Ads, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that's like a common thing that I've seen is just informing the person about the risk is or getting two neighbors to talk it out if the tree is on a line between the two properties, or explaining the common sense behind a decision like you did. You laid out all the observable risks and whatnot with that tree, and once they see it, I mean, I've found that 99% of the time or more, maybe, you don't have to enforce it. You just talk to someone, and so even if your tree warden doesn't have that authority by law to force them to do it, it's an interesting role the tree warden can play, kind of as a addition to their written responsibilities, just by virtue of their knowledge base, that they can share that around and help people see hazards and deal with them.
Thanks, Ads.
No, it's a good point. We've had great luck just talking to people here. This particular case was different. Absentee landlord didn't want to deal with anything. That's why, you take the next step, send a registered letter, so they actually have to sign for it.
Definitely, there's a lot of merit to having folks be aware of tree ordinances and what the rules, the ordinances actually are in your municipality, so that when these issues come to a head, no one is surprised. But yeah, they're pretty long, beefy documents. They're not easy to talk about a lot. So having a scenario in which you're out talking to folks one-on-one can help you get ideally to an agreement without actually having to enforce. But you have the legs there in an ordinance, not a policy, as Warren said, to enforce what you need to enforce as needed. I'm going to fly through the 10 kind of headings that our program is recommending for tree ordinances. Each one of them has its own section in our guide about what should and could be in there, some key takeaways. And then I'm going to just fly through only so that I can pass it to Mary and Robert in just a moment. But you're going to have a title, make sure it's short and precise, an intent and purpose, which ultimately ends up being more like a summary. You might want to save that for last after you've gone through everything, to then go back and make sure you're highlighting the overall benefits of trees and how that's going to be cultivated in your community. Section 3, super important. Remember, we spoke earlier about the words that are defined in state statute now. So even if you don't like using shade tree that way, it doesn't matter. That's what the state law says. And then you have an opportunity to define things further as you feel. One piece that's kind of bubbled up in conversation over this winter among our staff is the word cut. That it's not actually defined. If there are fines for willfully marring or defacing shade trees. The tree warden needs to be consulted for cuts to shade trees. And that could mean anything from cutting down a tree to properly pruning a tree to hacking off an end with a hockey stick when you go by. Like all these different kinds of cuts are put under this same title of cut. And that this may be something that's very important for your municipality to define as you see fit, primarily as related to the duties of the tree warden. Is the tree warden approving an overall yearly plan for cutting, meaning pruning of shade trees? And is that different from something that isn't a proper pruning cut? What does that all look like? So that was an interesting detail that has come to head again. There's a section on jurisdiction. Remember that the tree warden is an appointed position by the select board, and the budget flows from the select board. So that is, or the legislative body, that is an important part of clarifying who the tree warden is reporting to, and then how else the tree board will be integrating into all this decision flow. Administrative responsibilities, what processes are already there that can just clarify things right away for the tree warden, and who can assist in any of those duties. To fly through the last 5, tree management, control of risk trees and infested trees, again, getting back to defining risk tree and clarifying how risk is going to be evaluated, since it is not defined in statute. Appeals, there's a long section in state statute about what happens if the tree warden says that a shade tree should be removed, and that notice is posted, and then someone disagrees. There is a long process for appeals to that decision by the tree warden that is clearly outlined, and everyone has that time and ability to appeal a shade tree removal. There's not a lot of processes in there that are defined for a tree warden to initially have the power to say, this tree is not infested, it's not a risk, it's not posing any of these problems that you say, and I don't approve its removal. What does that look like for the municipality? How is the tree warden's position supported? How do people appeal that decision? It's kind of a hole that you might like to fill through a process, again, to help your tree warden streamline their decision making. Last 2, we've got penalties, so it gets a bit back to enforcing fines. Who will be doing this within the municipality, keeping in mind that your tree warden may be very good at that work right now, but perhaps your next tree warden may not be. What are all the different ways that those responsibilities are covered? And then a severability, just the legalese that wraps it all up at the end. You will have VLCT and hopefully a municipal attorney to work on that. So that is a much too fast tour through what this looks like. Again, we do have the guide now, which I'm just going to put in the chat. And while I find that link, that guide gets into kind of each of those sections about what you might like to include and key points, key concerns, references to state statutes. We elected as a program not to cherry pick from the statutes and put each one of them in the guide. There is a full list again at the end, but I'll really kind of end where I started in saying that you have to have a firm understanding of state statutes as related to municipal trees before you can really start to build or update your tree ordinance from there. I'm going to pass it to maybe Mary first and Robert second, or you can switch, whichever you like. So Mary and Robert are both in Brattleboro. I'd love for you to quickly introduce yourself and say kind of what role you have in the municipality. Maybe each of you could do that, and then one of you could kind of launch into your experience updating Brattleboro's tree ordinance. That was something you did 2 years ago. Probably took a year, but finished about 2 years ago. So maybe I'll go to Mary first.
So my name is Mary Henninger, and I am just a resident of Brattleboro and a member of the Tree Advisory Board. So when the state law was revised, we had an existing tree ordinance, which is maybe something that many municipalities don't already have. But we had one that Robert can talk about. It was finalized in 2004. So I was able to take that ordinance and build from it, incorporating all the new requirements of the state law. I will say that I'm super jealous of those of you who may be working on it only now, that you have all these resources from UCF, because we had none of those, and it was really difficult. So we started working on it in early 22, and it didn't get finalized for more than a year later, even with an existing ordinance to start from. So having now listened to Joanne, there are things that I wish we had included that we didn't, but I'm probably not going to revise it at this point. Sorry.
I'm Robert Clements, and I've been on the Tree Advisory Board for 3 decades. Excuse me. we were created as a tree advisory board when the DPW took down a row of mature pine trees. And the town citizens objected to that. There was no recourse for them because there was no tree ordinance. So they created a tree board and asked us to write an ordinance. It took 8 years. I only worked on it 3 years, the last 3 years, but it was adversarial in the creation, and people didn't want to give up their responsibilities. Eventually, we were able to address everybody's concerns and adopted a tree ordinance. And as Mary pointed out, we had that in hand, so we could just modify that tree ordinance to comply with the new shade tree or guidelines from the state.
I will say that the most difficult thing that we did, that I probably spent more time on than anything else, was definitions. That's the basis of the entire ordinance, is definitions. What's a shade tree? In our case, we also have a definition for a street tree, because there are a lot of street trees that we wanted to protect, but not with the same protections as a shade tree. So we have street trees and shade trees, and our shade tree definition is far broader than the state minimum limit. And then another difficult discussion that we had was exactly specifically what kind of trees should not be shade trees. And then you get into the discussion of invasives. So is that 25-year-old buckthorn a protected tree or not a protected tree? That was difficult. So I would encourage all of you to spend a lot of time thinking about what exactly is a shade tree in your towns.
I remember as well, Mary, that you had different designations for shade trees depending on the zone of the town, like per actual zoning regulations or per actual zoning of the town. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I mean, I can read it to you. We first split it up and said if it's depending on size. So any tree which is 9 inches or greater in caliber, for instance. But if it's a smaller tree, and it happens to be and these are the legal definitions per our zoning ordinance, if they happen to be in the urban center, the village center, the neighborhood center, mixed use areas, residential neighborhoods, or industrial and institutional zones. And, and so then one of the things that had changed between 2004, when the previous ordinance was approved, and in 2022 was that all those zoning designations had changed in the zoning ordinance. And so what was in the existing ordinance didn't really work anymore because everything had changed, and the maps produced by the zoning folks in town had changed. So keeping it up to date is something else that you need to worry about, that you may not know that the zoning commissions has changed all their names. And the other thing that I want to encourage people to do is that Joanne's talked about the fact that trees are discussed in more than one state statute. And so you need to follow all the links and get to everywhere you need to go. But the same is true in town regulations. So I found trees discussed in the zoning area in Brattleboro, in the some of the DPW requirements, in the sidewalks ordinance. I mean, there were little bits of tree statute tucked in all over the place. And it wasn't in our bailiwick to modify those statutes. So neither do we want to double dip. You don't want to have one ordinance that says one thing and another ordinance that says the same thing, because I made sure they were the same, but they may not be the same a year from now. And then you've got two competing ordinances. So you don't want to double dip. Make sure that you know what's discussed elsewhere in your town and that you're not talking about the same thing. It only needs to be one place.
Thanks, Mary. Ads, did you want to weigh in with something?
No.
You're muted. Ads, you're muted.
Awesome. Okay. Okay. So in hindsight, for Brattleboro, I got two questions, so I'll just ask them both and let you go to town. But the first question is, you mentioned that the zoning that you were referencing changed in your ordinance. Is there another method of referencing geography in your town that you wish you would have started with besides zoning in order for it to be longer lasting, or maybe just have it be less of a pain later? And my second question is, you mentioned that the original impetus for writing the ordinance came from the removal of a bunch of large pine trees. I think that was your first draft of the ordinance. I'm curious how you think that event, which led to the writing of the ordinance, impact the finished product of the ordinance, and whether you think. I guess I'll leave it at that and let you say what you say.
Mary, do you want to take the first part and I'll do the second part?
I've never thought about it, Adam, so I'm not sure that I can answer your question intelligently. I do think it's important that whatever designation that you give is legally understandable and definable, so that if it does come to an argument, that you have a defensible leg to stand on. In our town, especially now with the housing crunch, there's a lot of work being done to develop some new neighborhoods, and those new neighborhoods would be defined under the existing zoning definitions, where if instead you said, well, everything between this street and that street is covered, and then a new neighborhood is built somewhere else and you wish it were covered, you're kind of right back where you started.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that there's a better way. I don't know. Haven't thought about that.
Adam, to answer your first question, the zoning hadn't changed in 20 years. And so I feel that if we have to keep up with zoning changes, well, maybe that's a good time for us to revisit the ordinance itself. And the second part of your question was, it was the tree board was set up as oppositional to town government. So we started off on different sides of the issue, and it took a fair amount of negotiation and understanding and communication to change that narrative. It took 8 years, but that narrative changed. Now we have a marvelous relationship with the DPW. They ask us for advice. They are very supportive of what we do, and that is an evolving that I'm pretty proud of. So to answer your question, It did influence the original ordinance, but that hatchet has been buried.